Hello, BookTube. Continuing my read-through of the Bone series, I am now on Book 3, Eyes of the Storm. Now, just to recap my history with this series briefly, I did not grow up with it. This was after my time. I discovered this series a bit late, but I discovered it while I was out in Vietnam, and I used to use it for several years to teach English as a second language to Vietnamese students. And now I am reading through the series again. So, Eyes of the Storm is the third book after Out from Boneville and The Great Cow Race. The Great Cow Race, as I said in my review of that book, is somewhat maybe the pinnacle of this series. It's when the silliness of the whole concept comes to a head, and it's got a great climactic, action-packed, slapstick ending. This, by contrast, is a lot more exposition, and the plot enters into this a lot more heavily. And again, when I was using this book in Vietnam, I would do a few panels of it every class period with my students, and broke it up into a lot of small chunks, but it was obvious that the story was hitting a few flat points, that we were having to wait longer and longer between big climactic moments, although there are a couple of them in this book. So there is a bit of a chase scene on the road here that is a little bit fun and helps break up the exposition somewhat. But there is a lot of exposition in this book, as various backstories are not fully revealed, but partially revealed. And I've gone back and forth a bit in my head, trying to decide if this represents a little bit of a narrative failing of the book, the fact that the momentum from the Great Cow Race couldn't be maintained, or if this is just the necessary path that the story needed to take. And I think I've come down on the side of the latter. I think this is the necessary path that this story needed to take. I know there are some people out there who think that the more you get into the epic battle between good and evil in this series, and the more you get away from the silliness that takes up the early issues, the more of a drag the story becomes. And I can see that to a certain extent that's true, but this is the story that Jeff Smith wanted to tell. The story that Jeff Smith wanted to tell is a story that starts out very Disney-esque, very cartoony, and then gradually transforms into a more epic fantasy Lord of the Rings type battle, with the cartoony elements still there on the side. And I think, given that that's the story he wanted to tell, this is the necessary transition that he had to make, and this is probably the necessary point to make that transition. So we start off with some of the fallout from the previous book. Foam Bone and his cousins are at the farm, adjusting to life in the countryside. The two rat creatures who had provoked the attack at the Great Cow Race are now hiding out. In the previous two videos I did on this series, I talked about how there seemed to be some mix-up between the brown one and the purple one. I'm not going to keep harping on that point. I think I've established that. So we'll just move on. There's some weird dream sequences here, which, yeah. When I was using this story in Vietnam and presenting only a few pages at a time to my classes, the dream sequences did really slow down the momentum of the story. But when you're reading this as a collected edition, it actually goes through quite quickly. So slows down the story a little bit, but not too badly. There is still some silliness going on here. Phone Bone and Phony Bone are not adjusting to life out in the countryside. And then they split up. Lucius is taking Phony Bone and Smiley Bone back to his tavern to work off their debt. And Phone Bone opts to stay behind with Thorn. And then here we have a little bit of a mini climax in this series. Now, the middle of the book seems a little bit strange to put this mini climax, but I guess the thing to keep in mind is this series was not originally conceived as a series of books. It was a series of issues that would hit the newsstand every month. So the fact that they don't perfectly, the climactic beats don't perfectly match up with the bound volumes is somewhat inevitable. But anyways, they're going through. The tension is slowly building as they see the rat creatures are attacking. And then there's some action mixed with slapstick. As the rat creatures attack, and Smiley Bone decides to start the cattle running and just go for broke. Yeah, this panel always struck me as a little bit funny, huh? This is his foot here, and this is his head here, and this, I don't know, it's a weird contortion of the body in a series which is otherwise, I don't want to say realistic, do I? There have been a lot of cartoonish moments so far. All right, I'm just going to leave that and move on. Ending with going off the cliff, and then a bit of comedy mixed in here. And we break that up with Phone Bone and Thorn talking a lot. And then Grandma Ben finds them. There's a rather maybe pointless sequence where Grandma Ben storms off into the rain for what seems like no good reason. I guess she wants to go out and talk to the dragon. It's a little bit unclear why she is doing this now. It is and it isn't. I mean, it's set up that she's really angry at this point. But to head off in this rain when she knows the rat creatures are around seems to me to be a lapse of judgment in a character which is usually established to have very good sense. So she seems to have taken a little bit of leave of her senses to go out in the rain like this. And it leads to Phone Bone and Thorn following her. Sorry, we'll skip that part. And then having the rat creatures attack them. Okay, the suspense builds up for a little bit. And then the rat creatures attack them. And then the dragon comes and chases away the rat creatures, as the dragon often does. In fact, that's usually what happens when the rat creatures amass, is that the dragon just comes out to save them. Which I guess brings up a point. Is the dragon really helping the story? Or would this story be better without the dragon in it? Or is the dragon being used once too often as a deus ex machina, or a get out of jail free card to chase off the rat creatures whenever they amass? Maybe it would have been better for our heroes to find ways to outwit the rat creatures without always having to rely on the dragon. But there we go. Now, while that's going on, we have our B storyline or A storyline, or I don't know, the alternate storyline, in which Smiley Bone and Phony Bone have set up a bet with Lucius as to who can make the most money at the bar. And this is more cartoon silliness coming in, which indicates that even though the heavy plot is beginning to move on here, we still have a little bit of silliness left to go. But we also have a lot of exposition left to go. So there's a lot of exposition about who Thorn actually is, and we are given the big reveal that Thorn is actually the princess of this land who has been kept out in hiding by her grandmother all this time. And we also get some exposition from the bad guys here, which is all talking in riddles, but I guess will make more sense as we go along in the story. There's talk here. So Thorn, they're trying to reach Thorn in her dreams. It says, even in her ignorance, her strength is great. But there is something more. As I reached out to her, a new beacon appeared. The red dragon seeks to bring a pawn into play. Do not concern yourself. So, as I have read the whole series at least once before. When I was using this in the classroom, we never got to the end of the series because we were only doing a few panels at a time, and I never stayed with the class long enough to get to the end of the whole series. But I did read and review on this channel the Bone Completed One Volume Epic Collection, in which I did read the whole series start to finish at least once. But I can't remember who the new beacon that appeared is. So it's not Thorn, right? Because Thorn is already established as being a great light. This is the new beacon. Yeah, the girl, her dreams are like a beacon. So Thorn's already one beacon. Who is the new beacon? Was that Phone Bone? I mean, he would be the only one who is new to the valley, right? I don't actually remember how that gets resolved. So I guess I'll as I'm reading through these comics again, I'll have to pay attention to see how that gets resolved. But yeah, back to the comedic elements of Phony Bone and Smiley Bone with the bet about who could do a better job running the bar. Then we have some slower moments. Thorn is moping after having learned the truth of her origins, and that goes on for several pages. And then, back to the comedic elements. So, and here it actually starts to get quite funny. A bit funny. They're doing a puppet show to try and get people over. This is something Smiley suggested a few pages previously. Smiley also suggested they could do a lecture series, which they never actually try, but suitably silly idea. They start selling a lot of beers, and then Phony Bone says, "Man, what are you doing, Smiley? Giving this stuff away?" And then there's a great panel where he suddenly realizes that actually is what Smiley is doing. So he has to get them all back. And then Smiley Bone says, "Oh, I wish Phone Bone's dragon were here." Which causes the townspeople to start talking about dragons. And then, eventually, Phony Bone sees a way that he can take advantage. And this is, again, just classic cartoony stuff. But well done. He says, well, now this is interesting. You say you've seen shapes in the woods, heard bumps in the night. You say it's not safe to go outside after dark. Yes, sir, I've seen these symptoms before. Oh, you think it'll never happen in a nice, quiet little town like this. But you can't stop them. They're here to stay. What are you talking about? Well, I hate to say this, but I think it's safe to assume that if you have one dragon, there's bound to be others. So the way he just perfectly assumes the character of a smooth-talking con artist putting one over on the small-town folks is just classic. Yes, and that'll set up the story arc, which will continue on into the next book, about how Phonybone is exploiting the fears of dragons to get power over the townspeople. And the book ends with Grandma Ben getting some weapons out of a chest, and then Grandma Ben and Thorn and Bone go off on a journey. And that is book 3. So I will get a hold of book 4 as soon as I can, and then continue my journey through the Bone adventures in book 4. I'll see you then, BookTube.